If you ever find yourself alone in your school with the lights out and the halls eerily silent, remember this. Whatever you do, don't fall asleep. Because if you wake up to an empty school, you're already too late. The shadows will move, the whispers will start, and you'll wish you'd never closed your eyes. 13-year-old Ethan Parker was exhausted. The school day had dragged on, and the corner of the library seemed like the perfect spot for a quick nap. He curled up with his backpack, the muffled sounds of the school day fading away as he drifted off to sleep. When Ethan opened his eyes, he was greeted by an unsettling silence. The library was dark, and the usual hum of voices was gone. Checking his watch, he saw it was well past 6 p.m. Panic set in as he realized the school had locked up, and everyone had gone home. Ethan wandered through the deserted hallways, each step echoing ominously. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist, and the familiar surroundings now felt alien and foreboding. He tried the main doors, but they were firmly locked. He banged on them, hoping a janitor or late-staying teacher might hear, but no one came. Passing by a classroom, he heard the faint sound of a chair scraping against the floor. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling. There was no answer. The room was empty, but the sense of being watched lingered. Ethan's heart pounded as he realized he was trapped in the dark, empty school, with night falling fast and an eerie feeling that he wasn't alone. Ethan's anxiety grew as he wandered the dark hallways of the empty school. The sun had set and the building was cloaked in shadows. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant hum of the air conditioning. Ethan tried to remain calm, but every creak and groan of the old school building set his nerves on edge. As he moved deeper into the school, he noticed how different everything seemed at night. The classrooms, usually filled with chatter and activity, now felt like eerie tombs. The lockers lining the hallways seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. Then he heard it, a faint, distant noise. It sounded like a chair being knocked over in a nearby classroom. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Maybe someone else was still here, locked in like him. He hurried towards the source of the sound, hope mingling with fear. He reached the classroom and pushed the door open, his flashlight casting a narrow beam of light. The room was empty, the desks and chairs neatly arranged. There was no sign of anyone. Ethan's mind raced. Had he imagined it? As he turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind him with a loud bang, making him jump. Panic surged through him as he fumbled with the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. He felt like he was being watched, and the feeling sent shivers down his spine. He backed away from the door, his flashlight flickering. The room felt colder, and an eerie sense of dread settled over him. Ethan knew he had to find a way out, but the school seemed determined to keep its secrets hidden in the darkness. Ethan's heart pounded as he fled the classroom. The oppressive silence was broken only by his rapid footsteps echoing through the hallways. The feeling of being watched persisted, sending chills down his spine. Every shadow seemed to shift and stretch, following his every move. As he reached the end of a hallway, he froze. A tall, slender shadow stood at the far end, motionless. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the shadow began to move, walking backward yet coming closer. Panic surged through him and he stumbled back, his flashlight flickering. He tried to shake off the fear, telling himself it was just his imagination. But the eerie sensations continued. Lockers began to rattle, windows emitted the sound of nails scratching across glass, and wet footprints appeared on the floor, trailing behind him. The air was thick with dread, and every nerve in his body screamed for him to run. Desperate to escape, Ethan darted into another classroom, hoping to find refuge. But the feeling of being pursued only intensified. The shadows seemed to close in around him, and the whispers grew louder, echoing in his mind. He knew he couldn't stay there long. The entity was getting closer. As night settled fully over the school, the atmosphere grew even more oppressive. Ethan's heart raced as he moved through the hallways, the eerie silence now broken by distant whispers and unexplained noises. Every sound seemed amplified in the darkness, and his fear was palpable. The whispers grew louder, echoing through the empty corridors. "What are you doing here? Go back. There's no way out." Ethan's panic intensified as he stumbled upon the staff room. The door was ajar, and an old record player inside began to play haunting music from the 1940s. The ghostly melody filled the room, making his skin crawl. He knew he had to keep moving. Suddenly, he heard a loud crash behind him. Someone or something was forcefully trying to break through the door he had just passed. Adrenaline surged through his veins as he sprinted down the hallway, desperately seeking refuge. He found an unlocked classroom and slipped inside, locking the door behind him. His breath came in short, ragged gasps as he pressed his back against the door, trying to listen for any signs of pursuit. The whispers outside grew faint, but the sense of dread remained. Ethan knew he couldn't stay hidden forever. He had to find a way out of this nightmare. The school had become a maze of terror with no clear path to escape. Ethan steeled himself for what lay ahead, determined to survive the night. The entity hunting him was relentless, and he could feel its presence drawing closer. Desperation and exhaustion took their toll on Ethan as he darted into the science lab, hoping to find a safe hiding spot. His flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls lined with old equipment and dusty beakers. He crouched behind a lab table, trying to steady his breathing and calm his racing heart. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. He could hear them all around him as if they were coming from the very walls of the school. Among the whispers, a faint voice, almost a whisper itself, caught his attention. It sounded like a woman, her voice filled with sorrow. "I made the same mistake when I was a child." Ethan's blood ran cold as he looked up. Standing in the dim light was a figure, an apparition of a woman with a pale, burnt face. Her eyes were empty, hollow voids, and her long, thin fingers seemed to reach out towards him. Her twisted smile sent chills down his spine. Before he could react, the entity's face began to contort, her smile widening into a grotesque, horrifying grin. Ethan stumbled backward, trying to get away, but his foot caught on something. He looked down to see a skeletal hand clutching his ankle, the broken bones of a forgotten student pulling him towards the horror. Ethan kicked frantically, freeing himself from the skeletal grip. He scrambled to his feet and bolted towards the door, but the entity was relentless, her whispers now a deafening roar. Every corner of the school seemed to echo with her presence, and Ethan knew he had to keep moving if he wanted to survive. His mind raced with terror as he fled through the darkened hallways, the entity's haunting laughter ringing in his ears. The school was no longer just a building, it was a living nightmare, and Ethan was trapped in its sinister embrace. The school's emergency alarm blared through the hallways, jolting Ethan awake. Dawn's first light filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Disoriented and exhausted, he stumbled toward the main entrance. His heart raced as he reached the door, hoping the nightmare was finally over. A watchman stood at the gate, unlocking it with a puzzled expression. "What are you doing here, kid?" he asked, his voice gruff but concerned. Ethan didn't reply, he just bolted through the gate, eager to put the horror behind him. At home, Ethan rushed to his mother, his words tumbling out in a frantic stream. "Mom, you wouldn't believe what happened at the school. The shadows, the whispers, the woman with the burnt face." His mother's face contorted in anger. "Ethan, I've told you not to go back there. You've been expelled for 3 years. Why did you go back?" Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "Expelled? But Mom, I was there last week." "No, Ethan," she interrupted. 3 years ago. And you've never been the same since." His head swirled with confusion. Desperate for clarity, he glanced at the mirror, and his heart froze. His reflection was absent. The room behind him was visible, but he wasn't there. Panic clawed at his chest as the realization hit him like a tidal wave. Was he still trapped in the school? Was it all a hallucination? Or had he become one of the shadows, forever lost in the maze of Blackwood School's haunted halls? The whispers, the laughter, and the dread weren't gone. They followed him. He could feel the entity's presence, always watching, always waiting. Ethan had escaped the school, but the terror was far from over. And somewhere in the dark, the entity still laughed, knowing that Ethan would never truly be free. If you ever find yourself alone in the schoolyard of Roosevelt High, listen closely. You might hear the ghostly whispers that have haunted these halls for decades. They say the school has a dark secret, one that claims the curious and the unwary. and once you're drawn in, there's no escape. It began like any other day at Roosevelt High, a prestigious school in a small American town. The morning sun bathed the red brick building in warmth as students hurried to their classes. William, just another student, walked through the gates, not paying much attention to the hushed whispers about ghostly happenings in the school. During lunch, William decided to spend some time in the schoolyard, away from the crowded cafeteria. That's when he noticed her, a girl sitting alone under the old oak tree. She was different, mysterious, and intriguing. Her eyes held a depth that drew him in, and he felt an inexplicable urge to talk to her. "Hi, I'm William," he said, trying to strike up a conversation. The girl looked up and smiled. "I'm Emily," she replied quietly. There was something about her that piqued William's curiosity. She was always at school during lunch, yet isolated from everyone else. As they talked, William found himself more and more drawn to her. Emily was charming, but there was an odd silence around her, as if she carried a secret. Little did William know, his curiosity would soon lead him into the depths of Roosevelt High's darkest secrets. William and Emily started spending more time together during lunch breaks. Emily was quiet but had a certain charm that drew William in. Despite her friendly demeanor, there was an air of mystery around her. She never talked about her past or her family, and she always seemed to be alone. As the days passed, William began noticing small, strange things about Emily. Her eyes sometimes seemed to reflect shadows that weren't there. Her movements were almost too fluid, as if she were gliding rather than walking. But William brushed it off, thinking it was just his imagination. One afternoon, while they were sitting under the oak tree, Emily asked, "Do you ever feel like you're being watched?" The question sent a chill down William's spine, but he laughed it off. "No, why do you ask?" he replied, trying to keep the conversation light. Emily just smiled, a hint of sadness in her eyes. "Sometimes it feels like the school has eyes," she said softly. The unease in William's stomach grew, but he pushed it aside, not wanting to appear scared. As the bell rang, signaling the end of lunch, Emily stood up and looked at William. "Meet me here after school," she said, her voice almost a whisper. William hesitated but agreed, his curiosity getting the better of him. Little did he know, this decision would lead him deeper into the school's dark secrets. As the school day ended, William found himself standing by the old oak tree, waiting for Emily. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the schoolyard. Emily appeared, her movements almost ethereal in the fading light. "Are you ready?" she asked softly, her eyes locking onto his. William nodded, feeling a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Emily led him towards the school building, her steps silent on the gravel path. They entered through a side door, the school now eerily empty and silent. The hallways, usually bustling with students, were deserted. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. "Why are we here?" William whispered, his voice barely audible in the oppressive silence. Emily didn't respond. Instead, she continued to walk, leading him deeper into the school. The atmosphere changed as evening fell. The once familiar hallways now felt like a labyrinth of darkness. Strange sounds echoed through the building, faint whispers, the creaking of doors, and the distant sound of footsteps. William's unease grew with each passing moment. They stopped in front of an old classroom. Emily turned to him, her face partially obscured by shadows. "This is where it begins," she said, her voice barely a whisper. William's heart pounded in his chest as he realized that something sinister was unfolding. The door creaked open, and William felt a cold breeze wash over him. The room was dark, save for a single flickering light in the corner. He could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching him, and the sense of being trapped grew stronger. As the clock struck evening, William knew he had stepped into a nightmare. The whispers grew louder, the shadows deeper, and the sense of dread overwhelming. He was no longer just curious, he was terrified. As the clock struck evening, William's sense of dread deepened. The empty school had become a labyrinth of darkness, with strange sounds echoing through the hallways. He felt as though unseen eyes were watching his every move. Emily led him deeper into the building, her presence now unsettling. Suddenly, Emily stopped and turned to face him. Her eyes glowed with an eerie light, and her once friendly smile twisted into a sinister grin. "Welcome to your worst nightmare," she whispered, her voice dripping with malice. The realization hit William like a tidal wave. Emily wasn't human. She was a malevolent spirit, a witch or demon feeding on fear. She revealed how she had been luring students into the school for years, trapping them and consuming their terror. Panic surged through William as he tried to escape. He sprinted down the hallways, his footsteps echoing like thunder. The whispers grew louder, turning into mocking laughter. The school's shadows seemed to come alive, reaching out to grab him. Desperation clawed at him as he ducked into a classroom, slamming the door shut behind him. But the room offered no sanctuary. He could feel Emily's presence growing stronger, her taunts echoing in his mind. The school had become a prison, and William was its latest victim. With his heart pounding, William dashed through the empty hallways of Roosevelt High. Every corner he turned, every classroom he passed, seemed to be closing in on him. The whispers and laughter of the malevolent spirit echoed through the building, taunting him, mocking his fear. He could feel Emily's presence growing stronger, her sinister energy wrapping around him like a suffocating blanket. Desperation fueled his every step as he raced through the darkened corridors, searching for any means of escape. William stumbled into the science lab, hoping to find a place to hide. The room was filled with old equipment and dusty glassware, casting eerie shadows in the dim light. He crouched behind a lab table, trying to steady his breath and calm his racing mind. But the respite was short-lived. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if they were closing in on him. The temperature in the room plummeted, and a chilling breeze rustled through the pages of an open textbook. William knew he couldn't stay hidden for long. He forced himself to move, slipping out of the lab and into the hallway once more. The shadows seemed to come alive, reaching out to grab him, but he pressed on, driven by sheer terror. He could hear Emily's voice, now twisted and monstrous, urging him to give in. William's legs grew weak, and his breaths came in ragged gasps. He found a locked classroom and hid inside, barricading the door with a desk. But he knew it was only a matter of time before Emily found him. Her presence was suffocating, and the walls seemed to close in around him. As the seconds ticked by, William felt a crushing sense of hopelessness. He was trapped, with no way out, and Emily was drawing ever closer. The fight for survival had begun, and he was losing. William's heart pounded as he hid in the locked classroom, his breaths shallow and rapid. The oppressive silence was broken only by the distant, mocking whispers that seemed to close in on him. He knew Emily was coming, her presence a dark cloud that suffocated any hope of escape. The door creaked open slowly, and William's eyes widened in terror. Emily stood in the doorway, her form twisted and monstrous. Her once innocent face had morphed into a grotesque mask of malevolence. Her eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and her smile was a horrific blend of cruelty and satisfaction. "Did you really think you could hide from me?" she taunted, her voice echoing through the room. William tried to back away, but his legs felt like lead. He was paralyzed with fear, unable to move as she advanced. Desperation took hold, and William's survival instincts kicked in. He grabbed a chair and swung it at Emily, but she effortlessly dodged the attack. Her laughter filled the room, a sound that sent shivers down his spine. In his final moments, William fought with everything he had, but it was too late. Emily's supernatural strength overwhelmed him. She reached out with her twisted hands, her grip icy and unyielding. His screams echoed through the empty school, a haunting sound that would never fade. The next morning, Roosevelt High stood silent and abandoned. William's disappearance remained a mystery, and the rumors of the haunted school continued to spread. The whispers of the past lingered, waiting for the next curious soul to fall into their trap. Have you ever walked into a room and instantly felt something was wrong? That's what happened to me in Chemistry Lab 666. Now I know why they kept that door locked for 50 years. My first day at Lincoln High wasn't supposed to be like this. When Mrs. Peterson handed me my schedule, she paused at my chemistry lab assignment. "Room 666, she whispered, her hand trembling slightly. "That's unusual." Walking down the science wing, something felt off. The fluorescent lights flickered, and the air grew colder with each step. Lab 664, 665, and then a heavy black door with faded brass numbers, 666. The notice board beside it caught my eye, yellowed missing person posters, some dating back decades. All students. All disappeared during chemistry class. As I reached for the door handle, a hand grabbed my shoulder. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," a voice said. I turned to face a pale boy with intense eyes. "I'm Jason, your lab partner. And that lab, it has rules. Rules written in blood." The bell rang, but it sounded different here, deeper, like a funeral toll. As the door creaked open, I caught a glimpse of something green glowing in the back of the room, and what looked like shadows moving without bodies to cast them. This wasn't just another first day at school. This was the beginning of a nightmare. "Don't touch anything," Jason whispered as we entered. The lab looked normal at first, rows of black countertops, Bunsen burners, chemical charts on the walls. But something felt wrong. The air tasted metallic. Mrs. Rivera, our chemistry teacher, was writing formulas on the board, but they weren't like any chemical equations I'd seen before. Symbols I didn't recognize, mixed with numbers that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. "Today's experiment is simple," she announced, her voice oddly distant. "Just follow the instructions." But when I looked down at my worksheet, the words were blurring, rearranging themselves. That's when it happened. The green liquid in the beaker next to me started bubbling on its own. No heat, no catalyst. Just bubbling. And in those bubbles, I swear I saw faces. Jason grabbed my arm, his fingers ice cold. "Don't look too closely," he warned. "They like it when you look." Behind us, someone's graduated cylinder shattered. But when I turned around, nobody was there. Just an empty seat, still warm, and a notebook open to a page filled with the same strange symbols from the board. The bell couldn't come soon enough. But as we packed up, Jason slipped me a crumpled note. "Meet me in the library. There's something you need to see about 1966. The library was empty when I got there, except for the ancient librarian who seemed to look right through me. Jason was already in the archives section, surrounded by old yearbooks and newspaper clippings. "Look at this," he said, pushing a yellowed newspaper toward me. The headline made my blood run cold. 5 students vanish from chemistry lab, no trace found. The date, October 13, 1966. My hands trembled as I read further. Their names were listed: Michael Chin, Sarah Williams, David Cooper, but the last 2 names were smudged with what looked like burn marks. "There's more," Jason whispered, pulling out a leather-bound book. The principal's private records. The pages were filled with incident reports, each one more disturbing than the last. Students reporting strange sounds, equipment moving by itself, and that same green liquid. Suddenly the lights flickered. A heavy thud echoed through the empty library. "Someone's coming," Jason hissed. But it was too late. The archive door slammed shut. The lock clicked. And somewhere in the darkness I heard Mrs. Rivera's voice. "So you found them." I was wondering who would be next. The temperature dropped. And that's when the real nightmare began. The darkness in the library felt alive, pulsing with a sickly green glow that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere. Mrs. Rivera's footsteps echoed closer, but they sounded wrong, like water dripping in a deep cave. Every 20 years, her voice rasped, "The lab needs new participants." The word made my skin crawl. 1966, 1986, 2006, and now, 2026. Jason stepped in front of me, his face pale in the green light. "Not this time," he said. That's when I realized he wasn't casting a shadow. "Poor Jason," Mrs. Rivera laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "Still trying to save them? Even after all these years?" The truth hit me like ice water. Jason's photo. I'd seen it in those 1966 files. He hadn't aged a day. "Run!" Jason shouted, his form flickering like static. But the library doors wouldn't budge. The green glow intensified, and Mrs. Rivera's face, it wasn't a face anymore. Behind us, books began flying off shelves, pages whirling with those same strange chemical formulas I'd seen in class. And then the floor beneath us started to dissolve, revealing the familiar black door of Lab 666 below. We were going back to class whether we wanted to or not. The fall into Lab 666 felt endless. When we landed, the room was transformed. Gone were the neat rows of tables. Instead, bubbling green vats lined the walls, each containing what looked like moving shadows. "Welcome to the real lab," Mrs. Rivera's voice echoed. Her form shifted between teacher and something ancient, something hungry. The air crackled with energy. "Tell her," Jason urged, his form becoming more transparent. "Tell her about the formula you saw. The symbols from the board, they weren't chemical equations. They were a ritual. A binding spell that had trapped souls here for decades. Including Jason's. Past victims emerged from the vats, Michael, Sarah, David, their forms twisted and green. But their eyes begged for release. As Mrs. Rivera lunged, I began reciting the formula backwards. The room shook. Glass shattered. The green liquid turned black. "You'll join us all," she shrieked, her form melting into something impossible. But she was wrong. Because I wasn't just reciting the formula. I was becoming it. The change had already begun. The transformation burned through me like acid. Every cell screaming, but I kept chanting. The formula wasn't just words, it was a key. A key written in the blood of every student who'd vanished here. Mrs. Rivera's true form emerged, a writhing mass of chemical equations and stolen souls. "Foolish child," she hissed. "This lab requires sacrifice." "No," Jason's voice echoed, stronger now. "It requires balance." The equations on the walls began to glow red. Each symbol a life taken, each number a soul trapped. As I spoke the final word, the room imploded. Green liquid turned to steam. Shadows became light. Mrs. Rivera screamed, a sound that shattered every beaker in the lab. When it ended, I stood alone. The trapped souls were free. But the price? I looked at my reflection in a broken beaker. My eyes glowed with the same green light. The lab had its sacrifice after all. They never found Mrs. Rivera's body. Lab 666 is sealed now. But sometimes, late at night, students swear they see a girl with glowing green eyes walking the halls, protecting them from what lies behind that black door. Some say she's still looking for Jason.